if I click on share screen, then I should be able to bring it up. I don't think I've got computer sound, but I'll click that anyway. And okay. Okay, can you see the screen okay?
Yes, yeah. Carry on. Good.
All right, I'll just try and... Okay, good. Okay, I'm set to go. So what I'm going to be covering today is these topics. I first want to talk about the theoretical preliminaries to discussing case alignment. And then after that, we'll look at diachronic sources of case marking morphology, because that's a topic that's germane to the talk today as well. Then I'll share some examples of differential case marking, how it's used. In particular, I'm focusing on the non-syntactic motivations for the case marking. And then I'll finish up briefly with a short discussion of the implications for the theories of case marking and diachronic development of case marking alignment patterns, in particular, what the languages of the Tibeto-Burman languages of Northeast India have got to offer typology, because I think we have a chance to make quite a contribution to this area of linguistic research. So firstly, theoretical preliminaries. The diachrony of alignment involves, well, it represents an abstraction of the grammatical encoding of core participant roles. And perhaps it's good to point out that grammatical relations such as subject and object, which a lot of linguists assume are universal to language, are not necessarily found in all languages. And I'm going to argue that they're a late stage of development, and they need to be demonstrated by evidence such as a neutralization of semantic roles for grammatical purposes, syntactic pivots. So for example, in a language like English, if I say, Jack kissed Jane and ran away, then it can only be Jack who runs away. And that's because you can only coordinate the subject of one clause, or the S or A argument of one clause, with the subject of a second clause in English. Regardless of the semantic roles, they've got to be in S or A function. So this is a fairly late development, I think. And the Tibeto-Burman languages that we work on offer very good chance to see how case marking systems develop and the stages that they develop through. And grammaticalization studies, of course, is part of this topic. There's particular pathways of development, and the development is always from more concrete concepts to more abstract concepts in grammar. And this has been discussed a number of times, such as in this quote: grammatical morphology always arises from erstwhile grammatical words, so that morphological complexity arises from syntactic complexity via combination and later condensation of syntactic constructions. So this was Givon in 2009, but perhaps he's best known for this aphorism. Today's morphology is yesterday's syntax, and we're going to be looking at examples of that as I progress through the slides. So earlier work, I think, misunderstood the nature of case marking in Tibeto-Burman languages. And that's because there was an over reliance on elicitation. But nowadays, we're using more modern methods, and we're basing our analyses on narrative text analysis. And this is revealing an interesting subtype of relational marking in which you have non-syntactic factors determining the presence of, in particular, agentive case marking. And this has been reported now in at least 5 branches of the family. And it's interesting that even a language like Tibetan, this was once widely characterized as a canonical ergative language. For example, by Delancey, 81, then Dixon in his book Ergativity, published in 1994, Miller in 1996. But based on the work of Nicolas Tonadra, and I'm referring to the paper that he published in LTBA in 1991, the case marking system of Tibetan, it deviates significantly from a systematic case marking alignment based on the transitivity status of the clause. So if we go back and we get better data, then we'll see that the patterns that have been described in the past are not necessarily representative of the language, really. And that's a consequence of the collection method. Now, in the 21st century, there's been a major shift to the way that we collect our linguistic data, and Shobhana Chalia was talking about this yesterday, and how important it is to collect texts and to base our analysis on texts, because that reveals quite a large difference from the kinds of descriptions that are based on just clauses and sentences, which are translated maybe from a contact language. This is really no longer a valid corpus. With the recording equipment that we've got access to now, we can come up with much, much richer documentations, and we can reap the benefits of even deeper insights into the languages that we're working on. The patterns that we find in Sino-Tibetan languages, in Sinitic, it's mostly a topic comment type of information structure, and Lapolla 2015 and others have worked on this and demonstrated it. The syntax in these Sinitic languages is often pragmatically ordered. In other words, we have no evidence of grammatical relations such as subject or object, and we have no evidence of the neutralization of semantic roles for grammatical purposes either. In other words, pivots. Then this is the other interesting thing about these languages, the great diversity in their structure. When we turn to Tibeto-Burman languages, we find that you get dependent marking in all of the branches. There are nominative, accusative, and ergative absolutive patterns, but they're fairly rarely canonical. And these differential patterns of marking are more common. Now, the differential patterns are mostly for S and A marking, but there is also some evidence of differential O marking as well. And I've got a few examples of that as well. Some of the branches have got head marking as well, and these demonstrate hierarchical systems, some involving direct or inverse marking. The Speech Act participants are the ones that get cross-referenced on verbs according to the ranking hierarchy. You've also got egophoric systems, and these involve marking personal knowledge or whether the speaker or the addressee is involved in the event. And then you've got languages with double marking as well. So you've got head marking, hierarchical indexation, cross-referenced on the heads of the verb stems, but also ergative, absolutive, dependent marking on third-person arguments. Quite a range of marking. And I thought maybe it would be useful just to review these most common and best known typologies of alignment. The first one, nominative accusative, and this is, I want to stress this, this is a syntactically motivated case marking pattern. It's based on the clausal transitivity, and the A and the S argument gets the same morphosyntactic treatment. What do I mean by that? Well, they get the same case marking, or maybe they cross-reference their arguments on the verb stem, or perhaps their constituent orders are the same with, for example, in English, the S and A arguments occurring before the verb and the O arguments occurring after. And it's typical for the A and the S arguments to be represented by a zero morpheme. So if you're working on a language and you find that your so-called nominative case has got a marker for an overt marker of nominative case, probably it's not a nominative accusative language. You might want to consider other possibilities. On the other hand, the O argument does get the overt case marking. Now, in South Asia and other parts of the world, you do get some variation. Sometimes you get differential marking on the O argument, determined by things such as animacy, referentiality. For example, in Hindi and in Nepali, human O arguments always get marked. Highly referential, definite arguments get marked by go in Hindi, lie in Nepali, but indefinites don't, and non-humans may not either, unless they're also referential. So we get some variation with South Asian languages as well. And I want to stress this point as well, where when we talk about nominative accusative alignment, we're talking about the representation of a paradigmatic and overwhelmingly consistent pattern, which is motivated by syntactic factors. And now turning to ergative absolutive, in this situation, again, we've got a syntactically motivated case marking pattern based on clausal transitivity. So single S arguments of intransitive clauses and the O arguments of transitive clauses, they get the same morphosyntactic treatment, which might be case marking, could be word order, could be cross-referencing on the verb stem. And that's normally a zero in some languages it's no marking at all, but in South Asia, quite often you find that you have got an overt marker for for O arguments, sometimes S arguments as well, and Nepali and Hindi to some extent represent this. In contrast, the A arguments are overtly marked for ergative case, and I think it's important to say that it's a consistent marking pattern as well in order to distinguish it from the next pattern that I'm going to talk about. Some of these languages have got split alignment patterns, like for example, Hindi and Nepali, they have a split between ergative absolutive and nominative accusative based on aspect. Then some languages have a split based on tense, like Kashmiri, and so on. So we get a little bit of variation as well, even in these languages with syntactically motivated marking. But again, I want to stress that it's syntactic factors that determine the marking overwhelmingly and not pragmatic context. So this brings us now to optional ergativity, and this term was popularised by Phil McGregor working on Australian languages, and a lot of Australianists have adopted it. It became a little bit popular when Tibeto-Burmanists first started working on these languages as well and started to recognise this interesting pattern. What I'd like to do is I'd just like to draw your attention to the red italic font here. Whether or not the NP is marked by case marking, the clause will thus convey roughly the same representational meaning. Okay, I keep that in mind. I'll also mention that the scare quotes are there for a good reason, because people use scare quotes when something is not really true. So even though it's called optional ergativity, even the people who use this term admit readily that it's not really optionality. I think it's a problem calling it a type of ergativity, because what it's doing is it's obfuscating our understanding of how alignment patterns develop. And just here's an example to show how this previous statement that the clause will thus convey the same representational meaning is problematic, because the presence in a language where you've got noun phrase ellipsis, you've got to say a transitive clause and you allied one argument. Well, the presence of the case marking is going to tell us whether an argument is in a agentive kind of a role or a patientive role. And we see this with this example from Kurtok, documented by Graham Hislop. She noted that if in the first clause in A, without the gi agentive marker, it's understood as two fishermen were pitied, but if the marking is present, then it means the two fishermen felt pity. So now these are functioning as an A argument, whereas these guys here, this one here is functioning as, if this is an intransitive clause with only one argument, definitely not as an A. So that definition of optional ergativity is problematic for our languages with all of their ellipsis of noun phrases. All right, so let's look at the major patterns in Tibeto-Burman. We've got normative accusative, we've got ergative absolutive, and we've got these differential marking patterns. Now, I would argue that the differential marking pattern is a precursor to both of the alignments that we looked at before, certainly in Tibeto-Burman, but quite possibly further afield in other language families as well. And it's likely that the primary motivation for the initial development of the marking is to disambiguate semantic roles, just as we saw in the Kurtop examples. But we found also that there are other non-syntactic uses as well. So, for example, here's a list, atypical constituent orders. When the patient NP precedes the agent NP, then normally the most salient argument goes at the beginning of the clause. And so to override the assumption that that is the A argument, then you need to put case marking on the second argument in the clause. Otherwise, the first argument will be understood as being the A argument. So it disambiguates there. It can also be used for contrastive reference as well, to distinguish one referent from another, or to foreground a referent from others. It can be used to encode extraordinary, willful, or atypical behaviour, especially when there's an unexpected turn of events. It can be used to clarify the semantic role of the remaining core argument, and we saw an example of that earlier when an argument of a transitive clause is elided and there's one left. And in some languages, it's used to distinguish a causative argument from other arguments in a causativized clause. We'll look at some examples of this a little later. And also, sometimes it's used to encode a habitually acting referent or a universal truth. And I'll also show examples of this towards the end of the slides as well. So here's a list of the languages that, it's a brief survey, I'm sure there's lots more, but so far, this is how many languages have been demonstrated to have this pragmatically determined core case marking pattern motivated by the kinds of factors we saw on the previous slide. And I expect that we will see this list grow more and more as we become more focused on corpus-based analyses and we get better data. We'll start to see the patterns of case marking, and we'll see also that they diverge from those well-known normative, accusative, and ergative absolutive patterns. This is just to give you another perspective on the marking pattern. You can see that all of these yellow pins here represent languages that use, to some extent, differential agentive marking. And it represents a number of different branches. So these are geographically diverse as well. It's probable that the branches split off at a very early stage of the family. And Lapolla 1995 has shown that there's no common forms that can be reconstructed back to Proto-Tibeto-Burman, which also suggests that they've developed independently. And spread through language contact is unlikely because of the different directions of migration and also because of the geographical spread, which is quite fast. And it's raining again here in Singapore. So it looks like the development of the agentive marking in so many different branches is most probably related to drift, which was first described by Edward Sapir 1921, but was again cited in relation to Tibeto-Burman languages by Lapolla in a 1994 paper. So, next topic is, how does case marking morphology develop? Well, we've got relational morphology involved in this kind of development. Initially, you've got these compounds which may or may not have a genitival marker on the genitival argument, and we've got a juxtaposition, and the second noun is expressing quite often a location, some kind of a spatial meaning. So that's initially the head of the construction. But what happens is that this undergoes grammaticalization. It starts to become, it develops a more abstract kind of a meaning, and it develops into a postposition, and it cliticizes onto the noun. So what was the old head ends up becoming a clitic, which encodes some kind of a spatial relationship to that, that noun. And this is the beginnings of a new case marking function. And the patterns that we come across is some kind of a locative or spatial meaning developing into a dative, which develops into an animate P marking and becomes, in some cases, an accusative marker as well. And we see that with Hindi, we see that with Nepali, with go and lie that I mentioned before. But another possibility is that you start with a locative spatial meaning, and that develops a kind of an instrumental ablative meaning, maybe in addition to other spatial meanings, and that then could be metaphorically extended to distinguishing an A argument in a transitive clause to disambiguate. And the end result of this pathway is that you could end up with a overtly marked ergative argument whenever you've got a transitive clause and an A argument. Okay, so initially it's going to be pragmatic core marking to start with, and the motivations are going to be the things that I showed on the earlier slide. The end stage is reached when it becomes obligatory for the marking to occur in all situations. So I would argue that many Tibeto-Burman languages are in a transitional stage at the moment. Perhaps they're heading down this pathway and they could get all the way down here, but they may be, stuck at this agentive, pragmatically motivated agentive marking stage for a long time. And I'm going to show you some data from the Alec languages now. And you can see first that the agentive and the instrumental have got the same form across all of these. So this is called syncretism, case syncretism, and it suggests that they come from the same source, according to the previous slide that I showed you. We also see that we've got this interesting agentive, instrumental, and allative syncretism. And again, this is why it's great to work on these languages. This is the rarest syncretism in the world, and it's never been reported before. I wrote about it in this, this paper, 2011. We've also got some interesting things happening over here. The ablatives are a compound or case stack type of case marker. So you can see that, for example, nung here is the locative and E is the agentive marker. And jing is a locative, and there's jingna combining with na for yinchung. And then we've got something similar for lota, and same for sanctum as well, la, lana. So this, of course, makes us suspicious, right? Where does all this come from? How did these agentive markers develop this core marking function from an oblique function? Let's move on. I just want to share this with you. This is a pair of Levi's 501s, famous jeans. What do you use that little pocket for? Do you use it for keeping keys? Or do you keep coins in it? Or do you keep your pocket watch in it? Well, it's a pocket watch pocket, actually. That was its purpose. But this is an example of how things get reanalyzed and maybe an old function is kept alongside of a new function. So there's some ambiguity with what the function could be. And same with this, when we look at this vase, or is it figures? What's our output? It could be two figures, two women facing each other, or it could be an ornate vase. The output depends on the context, I suppose, right? So this is another aspect of grammaticalization. There's some ambiguity, an old function and a new function, and either one are available for, or is available for maybe a prolonged period of time. So we've got this very common na or ne form in the Al group, or I should have the upside down V as well in there because I've just changed that after working on Sanctum. This plausibly reconstructs to Proto-Al as a form na, and I think that's a reflex of this Proto-Tibeto-Burman reconstruction for side or rib. It occurs in Zhongli Al as the na, and that's a part of, sorry for the typo, the side of the body at the waist, that portion which there are no protecting ribs and the outside body or wall of the body is thin. And that's described as in that manner by Clark in his 1911 dictionary. Now, side is a well-known grammatical source for lexical morphemes, and particularly locatives in Chinese, in French-based Creoles as well. And side is grammaticalizing again in Mongsen Ao as well as a locative marker. So we see it here. So tangi is the full noun, but tang is starting to develop as a postposition here. And you can see that it's closest to the noun phrase. Well, we've got a numeral in there, but it's closest to the head. And then you've got an old case marker on the outside here. So this is a new one that's been grammaticalized, and it's pushed this one to the outside. So this process can be repeated, and you can get diachronic layers of new case markers forming as well. Common targets for grammaticalization are body part terms and relational nouns in these appositional types of constructions like back, mouth, face, stomach, side. Here's a list of the ones that I've come across in Mongsen when I was documenting the grammar. Notice that they occur with other spatial locatives as well, or obliques. This is very, very common. And you can see that this reanalysis is taking place. We've got grammaticalization of a possessive kind of meaning, back occurring in this noun phrase, but it's from Deshin, the word for back in Mongsen. And we see it again here in another example with Tongat Lira Shin. So this is encoding. That's an old relative clause, an old nominalization. So that's why you get a case marker there. Here's face doing it as well. I first went to Kensa village in 1996, and I asked a woman this question, and this is what she said to me, which puzzled me at the time. I was a fledgling linguistic student. But after a while, I realized that this meant not face, but above. So this is grammaticalizing as a superessive kind of a postposition. And here's another one showing, well, both face here and tongue, and here's na, the oldest one. Then, so this is the newest, that's the next newest, and that's the oldest. And you see how the case markers get stacked up in these kinds of constructions. You can see the history of the language. Stomach as well is one that gets grammaticalized to encode an inside, introessive, or even a subessive meaning, such as miri champuk goliao, which my native speaker said to me when we were working on a text together. So I quickly wrote it down. He's using stomach here to mean the underside of my foot. And you get this in other languages. Sanskrit, for example, has this form go, which I've already talked about. The source of that is meant to be the locative declension of kaksha, which means or in the armpit, I suppose. And Reinhold, in her 2016 book proposes that this was an extension to side of the body, and that provided the explanation for the grammaticalization of go was a marker of a goal in Hindi, and then subsequently used for the marking of recipients and patients. So it's not unusual to have a word meaning side to grammaticalize as a postposition, and then it can go on to develop other kinds of meanings as well. I don't know why I've got this line here. I must have done it, but anyway, it's not disturbing us. Okay, so so differential O marking in Tibeto-Burman is also found, but it's less common. And the motivations, I think, are the same as described for other languages. It's determined by referentiality or animacy. So here are some examples. This is from Lahu, spoken in northern Thailand. You can see that this form, ta, is used to represent the O argument of hit in 4b here, but it's being used to mark the recipient or dative argument in 4a. So this is the original function, and this, I think, is the metaphorical extension to marking an O argument of a transitive clause in order to distinguish who does what to whom. Then Kokborok is another language which has got the same pattern, and we can see that you've got a recipient argument here being marked by no, and that same form is being used to mark the O argument of send. So again, we've got an extension of function from dative to marking a core argument. So Lepola, in his 92 and 94 papers, he refers to this kind of marking as anti-agentive, or he started with anti-ergative, but he changed it to anti-agentive, and I think that is a good term for it because it's distinguishing a possible actor referent that is not the actor. Again, it's disambiguating semantic roles. What are the contexts of this different type of marking? Well, we've got the marking of human reference. When you've got a bunch of human reference, any of those could be A arguments. So you can use agentive marking to encode which one is the A. And absence of case marking means it's not the controller of the event. Here is another example showing that you wouldn't use it if you only have a single human in a human referent in the clause, because cars don't teach humans to learn to drive, right? So it's unnecessary there. I mentioned before how ellipsis is commonly used in Tibeto-Burman languages. So in Yongning Na, for example, the presence of the agentive marker again tells us what the semantic role of the participant is. It has to be an agent, but can't be an undergoer in that example. We've got in agentive marking and ellipsis, we see that, I can advance the slide, we've got how, again, when you've got more than one participant and you need to, and any of those participants could control the event, then you need to be able to distinguish which one is the controller and which one isn't. So in the first example, A, we see that this bar is unmarked, so that has to be an undergoer. Whereas in B, wazat here has to be the A argument because it's got the agentive marking. And it's essential to understand who's doing what to whom in this language. When it's clear who's doing what to whom, then you don't need to use the marking. Pigs don't kill humans, right? Humans kill pigs. So here you don't even, with a verb like kill, you don't need to mark the human here because we're relying on encyclopedic knowledge of relationships between types of participants, and it doesn't serve any purpose here. So even though it's a transitive clause, we don't have any marking. I think you should be able to see why I want to distinguish this from syntactically based marking, where it's determined by transitivity. In Zhang, when you've got a non-canonical OA order, like in the A sentence here, then you need to have the marking, because otherwise people might understand that the first NP is the A argument because it's more salient, right? It's at the front of the clause. But when you've got the A argument where you expect it to be at the front of the clause, then the marking becomes optional. Contrastive marking is also widely reported. For example, in Tibetan, I will go for you. Here, it's showing that this particular argument is the one that's going to go. So it's important here in the B sentence, the gifts agentive marker, it's he is the one who went, not somebody else. This seems to be pretty common. Here it is in Dharma, a language spoken further over in the Himalayas, beyond Nepal. So it's the girls who do it. It's being used to contrast, again, similar to what we saw in the Tibetan. And here in Sumi, I find this is an interesting example because we have a verbless clause, but it's still being used, the agentive marker is still being used to encode that, that it's the mother that is Sumi and not the father. And Kotop is the same. It's encoding that he here is the agentive form of third person. She went, not somebody else. So the marking's unrelated to valency of the clause, and it's applying to both monovalent and bivalent, or intransitive and transitive clauses, and even to verbless clauses as well. So it's quite different, I think, to the canonical patterns that we reviewed earlier. Here's an unusual thing. The king's living underground when he should be in the palace. And so Su is being used in Dharma to encode this unusual state of affairs. In Mongsen Ao, normally, so it's a mother-in-law who wants the husband to kill his child from the previous marriage, or else she won't stay with him. So, okay, I suppose maybe it's syntactically motivated here, but in the second interlinearization, it's for stay. Now, normally you don't use an agentive marker with stay, right? But here she's expressing a personal choice, and that's why the marker is there. And then lastly, we've got the one who was speaking. It's a sort of an afterthought, and so that's why we get the agentive marker there to, again, disambiguate semantic roles. This one, sometimes you can get your data from just watching and asking people stuff and then writing down what they say. So in the A sentence, this is the normal state of affairs. When you take a handful of paddy, you throw it on the ground and feed the chickens. B is when the chickens are stealing your paddy, drying on your mat in the sun. And that was said to me when I asked what was happening to my speaker. He got up and he chased the chickens away after that. So in this B context, the chickens were acting with increased volition, and that's being encoded by the case marking. Here's something from Shobana Chilia's work on Meitei. So this is in the A sentence, a normal state of affairs. Tomba's a vegetarian. Sorry, he's a non-vegetarian, so you would expect him to eat meat. But what if he was a vegetarian? Then this is an extraordinary event, right, for a vegetarian to eat meat. So N is used here to encode this extraordinary event. Again, you can see it's not based on syntax, right? Because it should be a transitive clause. Then the other thing is that you get the marking both on mono and bivalent clauses as well. Always verbs of speaking tend to take agentive marking in a lot of Tibeto-Burman languages. But what about crying? Here, a man is asking this woman before he tells her that the son has been killed, whether she's going to cry or not. He's extracting a promise from her, and he expects her to control the feelings. So that's why he's using the agentive marking here. And she confirms that by saying, Nina mechepu, sang, I won't cry, tell me. Again, we've got a typical use of the agentive marking from a transitivity point of view, but not from a pragmatic control point of view. Stephen Morey also documents this pragmatic type of case marking as well. And in this example, which I quote from his 2012 paper, he explains that it encodes that the elephant's pride affects the interlocutors, a group of birds and animals, and that's why you've got this agentive marker on the second person singular argument. Okay, so this is interesting, I think, because these are causative clauses, and this is where the marking becomes obligatory on the causa argument. And Shobhan Achalia reports very similar uses of agentive marking in equivalent contexts in Métis as well. So presumably it's because you've got lots of humans, right? And with causatives. So in this case, you have to use the agentive marking to separate who's causing who. And this one's interesting as well, because if it's an indirect causation, then you get dative marking on the causee. But if it's direct causation and the child doesn't have any choice, then there would be no dative marking. So we're getting some differential marking there as well. The other context where you get agentive marking is when there's a statement that particularizes the characteristic behavior of a referent. Like, for example, in B, I chop wood as a job, then the marking occurs there. But otherwise, if I said to somebody who's chopping wood, and this is how I got the clause, what are you doing? He said, Ni aseng sir, I'm chopping wood. So there's no marking there. Again, Shobhan reports similar uses of agentive marking in Métis as well. And here are the examples from Métis. You've got the agentive marking for this universal truth. Birds fly in the open air. The doctor attends his patients. Causative clause. It's the same as our. So that's interesting as well. Maybe this is the beginning of a syntactic-based pattern. It starts with types of clauses and then it gradually seeps through the entire grammar until you end up with a syntactically based marking pattern rather than a pragmatic one. Just to show you that you can end up with something approaching an ergative absolutive pattern, here is the Chang pronouns. This is a Konyak language spoken right next to the Awic languages. And I elicited all this data, but it's really interesting that whenever I've got an intransitive clause, I got the absolutive form of the pronouns for my speakers. And whenever I used a transitive clause, I got the ergative forms of the pronouns. So this language, I think, is further along the pathway to developing a ergative absolutive syntactic alignment. All right, we're near the end. To summarize, these languages of Northeast India, they're a fantastic opportunity for us to contribute strongly to syntactic theory and also to maybe even challenge typological assumptions about the structural diversity of human languages. Case marking patterns are unlikely to be revealed by just eliciting sentences at the sentence level or the clause level. We need to have the pragmatic context in order to understand why someone would use a marker in one context and not in another. And I hope that you can appreciate just how important it is to use narrative text if we're going to really deeply explore the grammars of these languages. And so this is just the third bullet point is reiterating the point that I made, that perhaps syntactic alignment patterns develop as a result of certain clause types requiring obligatory marking, and then that spreads through the language until it is all syntactically determined. Zhang, of course, is moving along that line, it appears, from the grammaticalization of ergative and absolutive pronominal forms, at least for the first and second persons. So how would it work then? Maybe first you've got a language with pragmatic organization, you've got no syntactic pivots, no voice distinctions. Initially, transitivity is not so relevant. You've got this pragmatic marking on the actor of arguments for disambiguating, or maybe you've got agentive marking on undergoers for disambiguation. But over time, there is a move towards a potentially syntactic pivot and other evidence of grammatical relations. Maybe voice distinctions come out. By this stage, transitivity is crucially relevant to the syntax, so you could end up with an ergative absolutive pattern or a normative accusative pattern. That's all I've got to say. So I look forward to discussing it with you. I've got a few pages of references here, but presumably we'll make the papers available to you later on, so you'll be able to get to those. Bijan, would you like me to stop sharing my screen now?
Yeah, please.
There we go.
Okay, so. Thank you, Professor Alec, for your thought-provoking and insightful presentation. So I hope there will be a lot of query and question to be clarified from our participants. So dear participants, it's the time for Q&A. So you can raise your hand and you can come forward directly to interact with the speaker to clarify your question and query. Yes, the first one is Satyajit Banerjee. Yes.
Okay. Hello, Professor Coupe. A very immensely lovely lecture. I have some couple of queries from you. So in the one of the earlier slides, you said that if the nominative is marked, then it may not be a nominative. So if it's not a nominative, then what it can be? A topic or focus marker? And why? And like, why is there a trend of nominative not having a marker, though it's the case? So this is my first question. And second question, you give a map, a linearization of grammaticalization path of accusative and ergative. So is it vis-a-vis TB languages, or this is from the literature of world language? And my third question is, from literature, we see a correlation between word order and case marking. So in TB, are all the languages? Does all the languages have this fixed word order, or there is flexible word order? And my last and fourth question is, when the optional marker, agentive marker is seen, can we make one of the conclusions as these languages are losing agentive marker, or these are purely on the pragmatic sense as you are claiming in this paper? So these are my questions. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for your questions. I hope I can remember them all. The first one, why is nominative generally zero marked? Well, I know that Martin Haspelmath suggests using the term subjective case for languages that mark the nominative argument, the S or the A argument, overtly. You get these in the Horn of Africa, if I recall correctly, but it's generally the case that it's an unmarked argument, because you only have to mark one argument, right? When you've got a transitive clause to distinguish who's doing what to whom. And in nominative accusative languages, it's normally the marking which grammaticalizes is extended to marking an O argument, quite often from a locative argument. So that just seems to be a cross-linguistic pattern. That's why I'm saying that it's very rare, I believe. I don't know of any Tibeto-Burman languages that overtly mark a nominative argument in a nominative accusative system. So that's why I think if you come across a language and it's got an overt marker on a S or an A argument, then you might want to consider whether it's a pragmatically motivated system rather than a syntactically motivated system. So I hope that answers your first question. The second one is in relation to the map, right? And those languages. That's based on just my research when I got interested from finding this pattern in the languages that I was working on, I started to look further afield. In 2011 and 2012, Shobana Chalia and Gwendolyn Hislop had a fantastic special session in a Himalayan Languages Symposium conference. I think it was in 2010. And then they published a lot of papers in 2 volumes after that in LTBA. So this was a fantastic resource for me to have a look at all languages to try and identify some sort of a common pattern to the marking that we saw. And that's what I represented by the map that I showed you, where those languages are spoken, to show that they don't seem to belong just to one branch. And it looks like it's independently developed in different branches, according to this idea of drift that Edward Sapir and Randy Lapolla have talked about in their papers. As far as fixed word order goes, fixed word order might develop in a language, but generally it's a case that pragmatics rules the roost in these languages. So the most salient or the most topical argument tends to come first in the clause. And whilst there is a tendency for clauses to be head final, which means that you've got the head of the noun phrase occurring at the end of the noun phrase, you've got the verb stem occurring at the end of the clause, the order of arguments, of NP arguments, can be varied according to whether you want to focus on the undergoer argument or the actor argument. And this is a way of achieving something similar, I suppose, functionally equivalent to a passive voice, because these languages don't have a grammaticalized passive. So they could use this as a way of focusing attention on the undergoer, in which case then you would need maybe marking to override the assumption that that first noun phrase in the clause is the A argument rather than an O argument. And I'm afraid I've forgotten your last question. So could you just repeat that?
Yeah. Say, Anthony.
I think you just have to unmute her.
Yeah, I unmuted her.
Hello. Yeah. So my last question was: can the optional marker be reanalyzed as the language is losing the marker rather than a pragmatic marker may, in the process of like maybe coming 100 years, it will lose the ergative marker because I say this, that there can be a loss of alignment, and ergative absolutive language can change into nominative accusative language. So can this be one of reason or case for optional markers?
Okay, thank you. That's a really insightful and important question, because yes, it is indeed possible. It is impossible for languages to lose their marking, just as it is possible for languages to gain their marking. So I suppose in situations of language endangerment, you might expect that happening. But the case marking serves such an important purpose of distinguishing who does what to whom. I think it would only be in a language endangerment situation where you might see that happening, unless there is some sort of a change going on, which has been suggested for some Indo-Iranian languages in Iran, which have switched. So yeah, that's another possibility, and it's probably one that I should have raised as well. I haven't seen it in the languages that I work on, and I haven't seen it discussed either in any of these languages, but yes, it's something that we would need to consider as well. So thank you for that question.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Sandri, thank you for raising these important questions. Now, we can take some more questions. Dear friends, please raise your hand to place your question to the speaker. Yeah, yes, Randy. Yeah, please, Professor. Yeah, Professor Randy, yeah.
Randy, maybe you can write your question if you can't get your mic to work, and I can respond when I see it. Because he is unmuted.
Yeah, she's already unmuted. Professor Randy?
He's working on an iPad, so, and it's a little bit different, I believe.
Oh, that may be the reason. Okay, let me check in my, okay. Okay, meantime, there is a question from one of our participants. So let me read it out. In languages with flexible word order and morphologically abstract case marking system, how can you realize the agentive case marking? This is the first question.
Okay, that was, sorry, the objective case marking, did you say?
Agentive.
Agentive case marking. Okay.
Yes.
Well, I think, you know, if you have variable word order, then it becomes very important, just like those examples from Randy Lapola's work on Chung show that when you've got the OA order, then that A marking becomes really important, because otherwise the addressee may understand that the first noun phrase is the A argument, because there is a tendency to put the most pragmatically salient information first in the clause. So I hope that answers the question. It seems that if you've got rigid case marking, sorry, if you've got rigid word order, then that minimizes the need for case marking, right? Just like in English. And that's perhaps the reason why English doesn't have case marking anywhere except in the pronouns now, because word order is what determines the grammatical relations. It's one of the pieces of evidence that we use for establishing subject. It occurs in front of the verb.
Okay. And same participants, as a continuation to our questions, again, she is asking, do we have to go by pragmatic system and assume the marker is there?
Well, you know, we have to let the languages tell us how to analyze them. We can't go there thinking that the categories that are used in European languages are necessarily going to fit in these languages. And I think that's been a problem in the past. Maybe that was a problem for why Tibetan was initially identified as a negative language, because there was this assumption that it fitted into the Tibetan. So I think we just need to describe the languages in their own terms. And if we come across these aberrant patterns, which don't fit into a neat ergative absolutive or a normative accusative pattern, then we have to let the language tell us how to describe it. And we need to come up with a new model, a new theory. And then we also contribute to syntactic theory as well, because I know that Chauvin has been trying pretty hard to convince the typologists in Germany in particular that this is a real deviation, but it's going to take more work. So the more people who approach the description of morphosyntax with an open mind and allow the language to determine the description, the better, I think, the better for our discipline as well.
Okay, all right. So I think the speaker has answered to the query. So dear participants, when you start speaking to the to the speaker, please identify yourself and the area which you are working. Yeah, yes, Professor Randy, please.
Hi, sorry, I had problems. This is the first time I'm using an iPad. I'm also in a hospital right now, actually, having something done. So it's kind of difficult and it's raining, quite noisy. But anyway, I just want to say that was very good, Alec. You know, really covered the topic very well. Just two small things I'd like to add is, one is in terms of the non-paradigmatic nature or the non-systematic nature of this, you can see that the same languages often have both an agentive marking and non-agentive or anti-agentive or whatever you want to call it, objective marking, and they can use them at the same time. So it shows that this typological idea that every language has to fit into a particular alignment pattern is just not the case. There are some, you know, that we might call neutral alignment, where they just don't have any particular alignment, and it's up to the speaker to decide what's needed based on, you know, the context and based on these pragmatic principles. The other thing is in terms of the development of the marking, as you said, it's often develops from locative type marking or locational type marking. And there's a certain regularity to this. I have a paper in 1995, I think it was, I don't remember, where I talk about when I looked at like 100 and something different languages and showed the using kind of prototypicality and markedness to show that there is a regularity to, like, for example, agentive marking developing out of ablative marking. So you often get ablative or instrumental and agentive being the same form because the instrumental and agentive are actually metaphorical extensions, or just extensions of the use of the ablative. And in some languages like Chinese, you just straightforwardly can use the ablative, which is not normally seen as agentive, but there are constructions where it does just mark agent. So this is a very common thing across languages. Again, it's although I talked about it in Tibeto-Burman languages, it's not specific to Tibeto-Burman languages. So the other thing is, one more thing about that came up in the question is grammaticalization is really just conventionalization. So when we use a certain pattern over and over again, it becomes a habit for us, and habits affect our sensibilities. So we come to think of a particular pattern that we use all the time as the right way to do something. And so that's how these things get fixed as syntactic patterns that then require some other kind of modification in order to adapt to that particular pattern in some cases, when you lose some of the freedom, for example, in word order or something else. So it's a matter of, what situations are you in? What type of patterns do you find yourself using constantly? And then this is how marking gets developed, but also how syntactic constructions get developed. It's just what people do the most. The more you do it, the more fixed it becomes. So that's my 2 cents worth. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Professor, for your kind observation and supplement. Thank you. Now we have next some questions. So next, yeah, Gorsham, you can speak.
Yeah, thank you, Vijay. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Coupe for this very thorough and very interesting topic and talk. And I would like to admit that some time back, I actually tried very hard in my language in Michelon, tried to give a complete syntactic analysis of the language and terribly failed, and came up with the similar kind of analysis with Professor Coupe just showed today. And for that, I mean, it's more enlightening to see more examples from the other languages, what we saw in the data. And some part of my question and answer I've already got from Professor Randy Lapola, and thanks to him also. And in addition to that, I would like to request Dr. Coupe to answer a few things, what I have in my mind. I just want to know, like the examples, I think when we try to give a complete syntactic analysis of the markings in our languages we have, and I think it would have been really simpler for us to go with that if it actually worked, but then it didn't work. So we came up with so many other things like those contrastive markers and animation hierarchy and different semantic rules and all. So my concern now is, like, when we try to gloss these markers, and because they seem to be behaving differently in different types of sentences, for example, because sometimes they are agent markers, sometimes they're emphatic, sometimes they're just marking contrast and other things. So how do we go about doing this, in your opinion, and can you give us some light onto that?
Okay.
That's all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Before I answer your question, I'd just like to acknowledge the influence that Prof. Randy Lapola has had on my own work. He's been mentoring me since 2004, and a lot of the ideas that I've developed about case marking has come through his influence. So thank you, Randy, for being such a wonderful mentor and teacher to me. And hopefully this tradition will also keep going. We'll pass down this knowledge and the kinds of questions that are coming, like, for example, this last question. these are the kinds of things that we really need to deal with. How do we deal with multiple pragmatic uses of the same marker? Of course, it would be very confusing if we just had a different marker for every single use, one for marking A arguments, one for marking contrastive reference. So I think what we need to do is we need to look at particular patterns and see that they're basically the one thing, but they've got extended functions that go in different directions. So all of the languages that I've looked at so far tend to have multiple uses for agentive marking if it's used for pragmatic purposes. I think that's okay. This is, you know, the nature of, I showed you that image of the vase and the two women, right? You can interpret things in more than one way. And this is the nature of grammaticalization. It involves some ambiguity. And that's why it's so important to have a context in order to understand what the meaning could be in that particular context. This is why it's so important to work on texts, because we need to have the pragmatic context. Just go for one label. If you've got the same marker turning up, just use one label for it when you gloss it, but then describe all of the different ways that it's used. And I think that will result in a useful and informative description of the morphosyntax. Thanks for your question.
Okay, I hope speaker has answered to Gulshan. So there is a question from one of the participants, Ankita Karmakar. So she wants me to read it out. So let me read it out. Can it be possible that one language have nominative, accusative, and ergative absolutive formation?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, look at Hindi. Look at Nepali. In fact, I think nearly all of these Indo-Aryan languages, except for Assamese, seems to have this pattern, right? Based on either tense or aspect. So, but once again, I would stress that this is a syntactic pattern, which is determined by some morphosyntactic criterion, some morphological category like tense or aspect or mood. So yeah, highly possible.
Okay.
Highly possible.
Okay. Yes, next is Dr. Nini.
Hi, Alec.
Hi,
That was
Mimi.
a very an interesting paper. Now, what you were talking about that the languages being in a transitional stage, and I totally agree with you. And this is what I had also pointed out in one of my papers, looking at Tenidie. Now, in Tenidie, the language, it follows a dual system of case marking. So we have the syntactic case marking and the semantic case marking. And within the syntactic based marking, the language exhibits split ergativity again, and then based on person and number. And another thing to consider when you talk about Tenidie is the speech of the younger generation, where the ergative marking is either totally dropped or used at all instances, irrespective of person or number, because the ergative marking is based on person or number. So the irregular nature of the e-marking is indicative of a case system in transition, and that the language is undergoing change, moving either from an accusative to an ergative system, or from an ergative to an accusative system. So yes, I totally agree with you. And about your agentive marking, if you look at the semantic based marking in Tenidie, where there are some verbs which are where there are some nouns which take the marking A again, which I have termed as the ergative marking. Okay, it kind of shows that it is in an agentive role. So yes, and I will look further into the other aspects which you have brought up. and relook into the case system in Tenidie. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks, Mimi. Again, you raise an important point in relation to this topic, that we have to consider the reasons why the language might change. And maybe we should be recording different generations when we collect our data, because otherwise, who knows, we'll be maybe documenting a language that uses a particular system that is going to die out with that generation. And it doesn't actually represent the younger generation, who are the ones who will be passing on their version of the language. So yeah, I agree with you. I think this is one way that a language might change from one alignment pattern to another.
And there was one question which somebody had raised. She had said that if a noun does not show a morphological case or an overt case marker, so she had mentioned that. But then one needs to keep in mind that when you are talking about the Tibeto-Burman languages, even though it is not overtly marked, you know, there is always the matter of tone, because tone, we do not write it down, you know, in the written form, whereas case is being represented through tone in some of the languages, and especially in Tenidie. So yeah, this has to be kept in mind too. Yeah.
Yeah, I've only seen that once. That was in Mongsen Ao. I recorded a story, and in the story, the speaker said Nina Sa, right? So I, attentive, spoke. But then when that was in the recording, but then when my consultant read it out to me, when he listened to the recording, he said Ni Sa. So I asked him, how come you're saying that with a rising tone and you're not saying no? And I was able to work out that the no was being, the segmental material of the syllable was deleted, but the tone was left there, and the tone attached to the preceding syllable, and that caused a rising intonation. So that's the only case that I've ever come across in all the languages that I've worked on.
No, in Tenidie also we have this.
No, okay.
Yeah.
It's more widespread than what I initially thought.
And in Kiamugan also it is showing up, where tone is being used as case, you know. So this is something which one needs to keep in mind, saying that there is no overt case marking, you know, but actually it is there, you know, like if you really listen to it. Yeah.
Yes, it's very common in African languages, of course. Grammatical tone is more common than lexical tone. But we don't really see a great deal of it in Southeast Asia or in our languages of Northeast India either, apart from the occasional case. I suppose it also makes it important for us to transcribe tone as well, right? And
yes.
Okay. Ma'am, maybe do you have some more observation or query?
Not really. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for raising this important aspect, as it's very interesting to learn that the languages, we have the languages where tone, the language which doesn't have an overt marking of the case, tone has played a very important role covertly to mark the case. So yeah, we have a next question from one participant. So Oppo A83. So you can unmute and speak. Yes. Please identify yourself as you join us by what your device name. We are not able to identify you.
Hello.
Yes.
Oppo, no? Yeah, it's me. Yeah.
Oh, okay, sir. But it's a very strange name, so we can't identify. Yeah. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Coupe, for the very interesting topic. The question that I have is more of a general question. So in your opinion, and also based on your presentation, you said that optional case marking, whether they are pragmatically driven or semantically driven, are on the process of change. So comparing two subgroup of languages of Northeast India, say the Kuki-Chin and also the Naga languages, on which you have worked extensively. So most Kuki-Chin languages have what you call more or less strictly rigid syntactically driven case marking based on transitivity. But in the case of Naga languages, you have this whole interplay of this what you call optional case marking. So would you assume that in the proto stage of the Naga languages, I don't know whether there is a proto stage, or perhaps in the history of these languages, Naga languages, what could have been the original case marking? And if they have changed to optional case marking, this case marking pragmatic or semantic, what could be the what you call motivation? What could be the social or whatever motivation they could have led to the shift or the drift in the case marking pattern?
Okay, well, I think it's probably the case that, I mean, where does case marking come from to begin with? Are languages born with case marking systems and cross-referencing systems on verb stems? I'm of the opinion that when a language comes into existence, it's probably in a very basic form. And if we look at grammaticalization studies, we can see that grammatical complexity develops over time. And in the slides I shared with you, there were numerous examples of words for example, face and stomach and side, back, developing into case markers. So this suggests to me that the languages probably are in a null state to begin with. They don't have case marking patterns, but they develop case marking in order to, as Randy LaPolla mentions, to more efficiently constrain the inferences of the addressee so that they can better understand the meaning behind the communicative act. So I think they develop over time, just like other types of grammatical complexity develops. And the result of that is that the language becomes a more efficient system of communication. That seems to be the motivation. Looking at, for example, disambiguating marking when you've got two, say, humans, and either one could control the event. It makes sense to overtly mark either the actor or the undergoer in order to clarify who is the one that's doing something to the other. So case marking serves a very useful communicative function to clarify meaning in interactions.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. I think the speaker has answered for Dr. Pautan's query. Okay, so next, we have, next is the Pangarsela Walling from Department of Linguistics, Nagaland University. Yes, Dr. Asen, you can speak now.
Hi, Alec.
Hi, Asen.
Yeah, salamo.
Salamo.
Yeah, it's a very interesting paper, and it's just like it's more like the continuation of our discussion on case marking system, which we have exchanged several times in email. Even in Chongliao, the tone is in the first person, both singular and plural. Tone is used to mark. The tone can be used to mark the genitive marking, just like Mongsen. One question which has been repeatedly asked by two of our participants, and which I just want to ask, which is not clear, is like, we have this genitive case marking, like for example, in a sentence like Panis ngajam, he drank tea, and we can drop ne, and we can say pas ngajam, which is very correct in Mongsen. So when we use ne, we say that it is a genitive case mark, the subject is a genitive case mark. Now in the case when it is dropped, ne is dropped, and we just have pas ngajam now, what case marking will it receive? Will we say that it is a nominative case, or does it receive any case? And my third question is like, we talk about isomorphism, and we said the tree like isomorphism in sin. If we at the text, the
Excuse me, Dr. Hassan,
yeah.
can you hear me? Your voice is breaking, so we are not able to hear you properly. So, can you hear us?
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Hello.
Yeah, your voice is breaking. So, yeah, let the Coupe to answer your so one and two question. Then we'll pick the third one. Yeah.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, because your voice is breaking. Let the network to be stable. Yeah. Yes, Alec, you can answer. Yes.
Okay, I'll answer the second question first. What case do you use for a zero argument? Well, when I submitted my my manuscript to Mouton de Gruyter to be published with them, Bernard Comrie reviewed the entire manuscript, and I was identifying an unmarked argument, giving that a case label, but he convinced me that there's no need to do that, that a zero argument doesn't necessarily need to have a case label. And that fits better with my understanding now anyway of how the case marking system develops. It starts from zero, and then one of those oblique relational or spatial case markers gets metaphorically extended, as Randy mentioned in his comment, to marking a core argument. So it's only marking one of those core arguments. So the other argument, because we're talking about a precursor to an alignment system, right? So I said, I don't think there's any need to give a label to a zero marked argument, because that's a construct on our point of view, right? It's part of our belief system that even a zero has got, even an unmarked noun phrase has got a particular case. But what I'm suggesting is that we just identify an overt marker on an A argument as an agentive, or an overt marker on an O argument as an anti-agentive, and don't worry about marking, glossing any other noun phrase that does not have an overt case marker, because you know, it doesn't have to be part of our belief system.
Okay, Hassan, you can go ahead with your the third question that you are supposed to ask.
Thank you. I'll do that. Thank you, Alec. We talk about in one of your slides, we talk about isomorphism, and we saw that both in Zhongli and Mungsen, there's this unlikely, you know, that rare isomorphism of the three case marking system. So it happens in a Cognac also, but in Cognac there are two instrumental markers, and even in Zhongli, if you look at the text, one of the oldest texts, which was translated in 5, we don't see the E, which is the instrumental marker E, Zhongli instrumental marker E. We don't see that it's been used. Rather, we see another instrumental case marker being used. So my question is, like, can we assume that the instrumental marker in Zhongli has gone through a change?
Yeah, why not? I mean, they keep coming out, these case markers. I showed an example which had 3 post positions stacked up, right? Or case markers after them. There was the ma, the face one, right? There was side, tongue, and then there was the old na, which was the allative. So they can get stacked up, and maybe you've got competition as well. Competition between different markers for a certain slot, and maybe one loses out over time, or eventually it disappears. So the thing about language is it's a dynamic system. It's continually changing, right? It's not set in stone, particularly these ones, because a lot of them aren't written. When you write a language, to some extent you set it in stone, because then people start thinking, oh, it's written like that, this must be the way that we speak it as well. But if you've got an unwritten language, it's unconstrained. and it can change over time freely. And particular markers can get replaced by other markers. I think that's a natural kind of a process, something we need to watch out for. Sometimes I find that there's a but nominalizer which has got instead in some examples for the conditional. You know how the conditional marker is pala, right? So wa pala, if you come, for example. So I find examples where there's a different nominalizer being used along with the la. So there must have been some competition between those two as well for encoding conditional clauses. So yeah, I think this is a natural kind of a thing for language. Asan, I'm afraid I've forgotten the first question. Can you just repeat that one and I'll respond to that for you now?
What did I ask?
Oh.
I don't remember.
All right, then, yeah, you can always post in our chat box also.
Sure,
Yes,
because,
yeah, as we are running out of time, this will be the last question that I have forwarded to your chat box. Please answer to that question. And yeah, Alec, can you see there is one query? I have that.
Right,
Yes.
From Dr. Halkett. If case developed to avoid ambiguity between A and P, P and O, same thing, right? Comma uses P, Dixon uses O. How did speakers avoid such ambiguities before cases developed? Maybe that's why it did develop, right? So it's a good question. I'm not sure what the answer is. How does it, just say, playing the devil's advocate, that it was there to begin with? How did it come into existence when we can see the evidence from grammaticalization that case marking develops out of what are relational nouns or spatial nouns? Perhaps they were there as well and they got replaced or they disappeared. I'm not sure. I think it's a good question, but I don't have an answer for you.
Okay.
Yeah, so difficult to say. Maybe they got by like Thai speakers do, or Chinese speakers, because those languages don't have, they don't have case either. But I don't think their speakers have trouble understanding each other. I don't have trouble understanding Thai speakers or vice versa when I'm speaking with them, even though we don't have case markers. So it is possible to still communicate clearly without case marking systems. There's lots of isolating languages without case marking systems, but this idea that if you can constrain the inferences of your speakers' communications, then it makes a language more efficient. So it serves some kind of a purpose, a functional purpose that justifies having case marking developing in a language. But thanks for your question.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you, Alec, for giving clarification and answer to all the queries and questions raised by our participants. Dear participants, we are very sorry that we cannot take up any further question as we are running out of time, but let's see if we have a time after the second speaker. Do you have any question for Alec, then I think he will be joining till the end of second speaker. So thank you. So with this note, we wind up the first session and we are moving ahead to the second session. Just give me a moment.